Life in Meadowbrook has always moved at its own slow pace, and for a while, I loved that about it. The quiet mornings, the open fields, the way the wind would rustle through the trees just outside our home, it all used to bring me a sense of peace. But lately, that same silence has started to feel heavier, more like a weight than a comfort. I guess it started when Daniel began traveling more for work. At first, it was just the occasional trip, 3 days here, a week there. But over time, those trips became more frequent, longer. Now it feels like he's hardly ever home. And when he is, it's like part of him is still somewhere else, still thinking about meetings and deadlines. We used to have a routine, simple things like making coffee together in the morning, sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sun go down over the hills. But lately, I find myself doing those things alone. The coffee still gets made. The porch swing still creaks in the breeze. But without Daniel beside me, it all feels a little empty. I've tried to stay busy, reading, cooking, walking through the fields. But no matter how I fill the hours, the loneliness creeps in. It's the kind that doesn't always come with tears or dramatic moments. It's quiet, persistent, like a shadow that's always just a few steps behind. I miss the sound of Daniel's laugh, the way we used to talk about everything and nothing, the comfort of knowing someone was truly present. Now, our conversations feel brief, surface level. How was your day? Fine. Need anything from town? No, I'm good. I've started to realize that even when we're in the same room, we're often in different worlds. Meadowbrook hasn't changed, but I have. Or maybe it's just that I've started to see things differently. The house we built together, once filled with laughter and warmth, now feels more like a place I'm passing time in, waiting for Daniel to come home, and wondering if things will ever feel like they used to. There's this quiet in the evenings that settles around me like a blanket I can't shake off. I'll sit on the porch with a cup of tea, looking out at the horizon, and just feel this ache. Not sharp or overwhelming, just steady, always there. I don't know when the distance between us grew so wide. It wasn't a sudden thing, no big argument or falling out. It just sort of happened, like we slowly drifted apart without realizing it. And now I find myself wondering what to do with all these moments we used to share, now filled with silence. The stable behind our house has become one of the few places that still feels alive to me. There, at least, I can lose myself in something simple. Brushing Orion, hearing the steady rhythm of his breath, feeling the gentle nudge of his head when I walk in. It's not the same as having Daniel here, of course, but it gives me a sense of calm, a bit of connection when I need it most. Some days, I wonder if Daniel notices the distance too, or if he's just too wrapped up in work to feel it. I don't blame him. Not really. Life has a way of pulling people in different directions, and I know he's doing his best. But that doesn't make it any easier. I still find myself wishing we could go back to the way things were before the trips, before the silence. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that something needs to change. I can't keep feeling like I'm living in a house full of echoes, waiting for someone to walk through the door and fill the space again. For now, I just take each day as it comes, holding on to the little moments that still feel real, and hoping that somehow Daniel and I can find our way back to each other. Most days, when the house feels too quiet and the walls seem to close in a little, I find myself wandering out to the stable. It's become something of a routine now, almost automatic. The moment Daniel leaves on one of his business trips, or the house grows too still, I grab my jacket, slip on my boots, and head out to where Orion waits. The stable sits at the back of our property, surrounded by a stretch of fields and old oak trees. And there's something about the walk there that always helps me breathe a little easier. Maybe it's the rhythm of my steps, or the cool air brushing against my face. But for those few minutes, I can feel the weight on my chest start to lift. Orion's stall is always the first place I go when I step inside. He's a bay gelding, tall and strong with a deep brown coat that glimmers in the light that slips through the wooden slats of the barn. He always perks up when he sees me, ears twitching forward, his eyes soft and steady. There's something grounding about him, something that pulls me back to myself when everything else feels like it's drifting away. I'll reach out to stroke his neck, run my fingers through his mane, and he'll nuzzle my shoulder in that familiar, gentle way. I don't have to say anything. He just knows. Some days, I'll stay for hours brushing his coat until it gleams or cleaning out his stall, losing myself in the simple, repetitive motions. It's the kind of work that quiets my mind, lets me focus on something right in front of me without overthinking. There's a peace in that, a kind of clarity I can't seem to find anywhere else. It's not just about the chores, though. There's something about being with Orion, about the way he listens without judgment, stands still without expectation, that makes me feel understood in a way I can't quite explain. I've always loved animals, always felt a connection to them that's hard to put into words. But with Orion, it's different. It's like he senses the loneliness in me, mirrors it back in a way that feels safe. He doesn't ask me to explain why I keep coming back to the stable day after day. He's just there, steady and calm. A quiet presence that fills the empty spaces left behind when Daniel's away. Sometimes, after I've finished the usual tasks, I'll sit down on the old wooden bench in the corner, just watching him as he moves around his stall. The barn smells of hay and earth, the air cool and still. And for a little while, it feels like everything outside those walls fades away. I'll let my thoughts wander, remembering better times when Daniel and I would sit on the porch, talking late into the night, or laugh over something silly. But those memories feel distant now, like they belong to another version of me. Here, with Orion, it's easier not to think about what's missing. It's easier to just exist in the moment, to focus on the simple comfort of being near him. There are days when I talk to him, not expecting answers, just letting the words tumble out. I'll tell him about how work feels meaningless lately, how the silence in the house stretches on too long, how I miss the way things used to be. He doesn't react, of course, just stands there breathing steady. But somehow that's enough. It feels good to speak freely, knowing there's no judgment, no need to filter my thoughts. Over time, it's become clear to me that these moments in the stable aren't just about filling time or keeping busy. They're about finding something real, something steady when everything else feels uncertain. Orion has become more than just one of our horses. He's a source of comfort, a way for me to anchor myself when the loneliness creeps in. I know Daniel thinks of the stable as more of a hobby, something practical. But for me, it's become something deeper. It's the one place where I can breathe, where I don't have to pretend everything's fine. And as much as I tell myself that it's just a way to pass the time while Daniel's away, part of me knows the truth. The barn has become my escape, my refuge, the only place where the ache in my chest feels a little lighter. And Orion, in his quiet, unwavering way, has become the one presence I can count on when everything else feels like it's slipping out of reach. I didn't notice it right away, how much my time with Orion was starting to feel different. At first, visiting the stable was just something I did to pass the lonely hours while Daniel was away, a small comfort to break up the quiet days. But as the weeks stretched on and the business trips got longer, I realized I was spending more and more time out there, almost without thinking about it. It became the one part of my routine that I looked forward to, the one place where I felt like I could let my guard down. There was something about Orion's steady presence that made it easy to forget about everything else. even if only for a little while. Each time I walked into the barn, I felt myself relax in a way I couldn't seem to anywhere else. He would lift his head, those soft brown eyes meeting mine, and it was like he understood exactly why I was there. No questions, no judgment, just quiet understanding. Over time, I started lingering longer after feeding him or brushing his coat, sometimes just standing beside him, listening to the sound of his breathing. I'd run my hands through his mane, feeling the smoothness of it slip between my fingers, and that simple act would calm me in ways I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the routine anymore. It was something deeper, a kind of connection that went beyond words. There were days when I'd catch myself talking to him more freely than I talked to anyone else, even Daniel. I'd tell him about the little frustrations that built up, about how the silence in the house felt louder than ever, about how I missed the way things used to be. I never expected answers, but somehow just speaking the words made me feel lighter, like I wasn't carrying all that weight alone. Orion would stand there, quiet and patient, his eyes following me as if he understood every word. And maybe he did, in his own way. There was a rhythm to those moments, a sense of comfort in knowing he was always there, steady and constant, when everything else felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. I started to realize how much I looked forward to seeing him each day, how my steps felt a little quicker as I made my way down to the stable, how my heart eased the moment I saw him waiting for me. It wasn't something I planned. It just happened. Slowly, quietly, without me fully realizing it. One afternoon, I remember sitting on the edge of the stall after brushing him down, the light streaming in through the cracks in the barn walls. The dust in the air shimmered in the sunlight, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of hay and Orion's steady breathing beside me. I felt this overwhelming sense of peace, like the rest of the world had fallen away, and all that was left was that moment. And in that stillness, I realized how deeply I had come to rely on him, not just as a distraction, but as a real grounding presence in my life. I don't think I ever meant for it to happen that way. It wasn't like I set out to find something outside of my marriage, outside of the life Daniel and I had built together. But the more distant Daniel became, the more I found myself drawn to Orion. It wasn't even about the conversations or the routine anymore. It was about how he made me feel seen, understood, without having to explain myself. The kind of connection that doesn't need words, that exists quietly, steadily, growing stronger with each shared moment. And the more I leaned into that, the more I realized how much I had come to need it. There were times I wondered if Daniel noticed how often I slipped away to the barn, how much time I spent out there. But if he did, he never said anything. Maybe he assumed I just needed the fresh air, the quiet. Maybe he didn't realize that the silence between us had become something I couldn't bear, that I was finding comfort elsewhere. I couldn't bring myself to talk to him about it. How could I explain that the connection I felt with Orion had become one of the few things keeping me grounded? That it filled a space that had quietly opened up inside me without me noticing? So instead, I kept it to myself, letting the days blur together, each one marked by those quiet moments in the barn. I didn't question it much at first. It felt harmless enough. But as time went on, it became clear that what I felt wasn't just a passing thing. It wasn't something I could brush off or tuck away neatly. It was something that had taken root deep inside me, growing stronger with each day, each visit, until it felt like an essential part of who I was. There was a comfort in knowing Orion was always there, waiting, a constant presence when everything else felt uncertain. And without meaning to, I found myself depending on that connection more than I ever expected. I don't know exactly when things shifted. It wasn't like there was some single moment that stood out. No dramatic scene where I suddenly realized something had changed. It happened slowly, quietly, creeping in over time, almost unnoticed. One day, I was just visiting the stable like I always did, brushing Orion's coat, feeding him, enjoying the peace. But after a while, those visits started to feel like more than a routine. They became the part of my day I looked forward to most, the place where I felt most understood, even if no words were spoken. I'd find myself lingering longer after the chores were done, standing by Orion's side, my hand resting gently against his shoulder, breathing in the stillness. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of something I couldn't quite name. It was comforting, steady. But there was something else woven into it, too. Something that made my chest tighten a little every time I left the stable to go back inside the house. I started noticing the small things more. The way Orion's eyes seemed to watch me closely. How he would nudge me gently, as if checking in. How his calm presence could steady me even when my thoughts felt scattered. I'd catch myself talking to him more openly, sharing things I wasn't saying to anyone else, letting myself be vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in a long time. Maybe it was because he listened without expecting anything in return. Or maybe it was because, out there in the stable, I didn't feel the pressure to be anyone other than exactly who I was. I didn't have to fill the silence or pretend everything was fine. I could just exist. And that felt like a relief I hadn't realized I needed. At first, I told myself it was harmless. After all, who hasn't confided in a pet, found comfort in their company? But the more time passed, the more I noticed how much I was relying on that connection to fill the spaces that felt empty elsewhere. I stopped brushing off how much I needed those moments. And deep down, I began to feel the lines blur. The lines between simple comfort and something deeper. Between routine and something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't about anything dramatic. It was about how I felt when I was there. About how those moments with Orion made me feel more grounded, more seen than I had in a long time. It left me with this quiet ache, something I couldn't easily shake off when I walked back to the house, where Daniel's absence felt more noticeable than ever. There were days I wondered if Daniel sensed the distance too. We still went through the motions, quick check-ins, polite conversations, but the space between us felt larger, filled with things unsaid. I wanted to bridge that gap, but I didn't know how to reach across it anymore. It was easier to avoid it, to keep myself busy, to slip away to the stable where I knew I wouldn't have to explain the heaviness I carried. And every time I stood next to Orion, letting the silence stretch between us, it felt like the only place I could fully breathe. I started to realize how tangled my emotions had become. It wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was something deeper, something tied to how much I leaned on Orion, how much I had wrapped myself in the quiet safety of that connection. I didn't want to admit how much that connection meant to me, how it filled spaces I didn't know were empty until I stood there beside him. It was as though I had built a world in that stable, a world where I didn't have to face the growing distance in my marriage, the ache of feeling unseen, a place where I could just be still and let the silence speak for me. The boundaries blurred without me realizing it, not in some outward way, but in how deeply I depended on those moments. And part of me knew it couldn't stay like that forever. Eventually, I'd have to face the questions I was avoiding. But in the quiet of the stable, with Orion's calm gaze and the soft rustle of hay around us, it was easy to push those thoughts aside, to stay just a little longer in the space where everything felt simple, safe, and understood. I wish I could say that Daniel and I noticed the growing strain at the same time, that it was something we talked about openly, something we faced together. But the truth is, it crept in so gradually that by the time I realized how far apart we'd drifted, we were already standing on opposite sides of something I didn't know how to cross. It wasn't like we had a big fight or one defining moment where everything cracked. It was more like a series of small, unnoticed shifts. At first, it was him coming home from work a little later than usual, bringing the stress of meetings and deadlines back with him. I'd ask how his day went, and he'd give me a quick, distracted answer before pulling out his phone or flipping on the TV. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that life just got busy sometimes, that couples go through quiet stretches. But then the quiet stretches turned into long silences, and those silences started to feel heavy, like they carried the weight of all the things we weren't saying. I noticed how our conversations had become surface level, polite, but distant. We talked about schedules, grocery lists, plans for the weekend, but we didn't talk about how we were feeling. I stopped asking deeper questions because somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting real answers. And when he asked me how I was, I found myself saying, fine, out of habit, even when I didn't feel fine at all. There was this sense that we were both tiptoeing around something, neither of us wanting to acknowledge how far apart we felt. I kept hoping it was just a phase, something that would pass when work calmed down or when we finally had some time together. But that time never seemed to come. Every time Daniel packed his bag for another business trip, I felt that quiet ache settle in a little deeper. He'd kiss me on the cheek, tell me he'd call, and I'd smile and nod, playing the part. But inside, it felt like I was watching him drift further away, unsure how to call him back. I started to dread the sound of the suitcase wheels on the hardwood floor, the familiar routine of him leaving, knowing the house would feel emptier once he was gone. The worst part was, I didn't know how to talk to him about it. I didn't want to sound needy or dramatic. I kept convincing myself it wasn't a big deal, that we'd find our rhythm again. But every day that passed without us really connecting made it harder to ignore the knot tightening in my chest. I could feel myself pulling back too, slipping into my own routines, finding comfort in things outside our marriage because it felt easier than facing the growing distance head on. That's when the stable became more than just a place to pass time. It became a sanctuary. It wasn't intentional at first. I'd walk down there after Daniel left, telling myself I just needed some fresh air or something to do. But the more I leaned into those quiet moments with Orion, the more I realized how much I was avoiding the reality of what was happening at home. I felt seen there in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. There, I didn't have to pretend everything was fine. I didn't have to fill the silence with forced conversation. I could just be, and that became a kind of relief I didn't know how to find with Daniel anymore. And even when he was home, I noticed how often I made excuses to step outside, to spend time away. It wasn't that I didn't care about him. I did. But the strain between us felt like this invisible wall that kept getting taller. And no matter how many times I thought about tearing it down, I couldn't figure out where to start. I wondered if he felt it too. The awkward pauses, the way our hugs felt a little more like habit than warmth, the nights we sat in the same room but felt miles apart. I kept telling myself I should talk to him, that I should be honest about how I felt. But every time I tried, the words got caught in my throat. Maybe I was afraid of what would happen if I said it out loud, afraid that naming it would make it real. So instead, we kept dancing around it. He'd come home, we'd go through the motions, and I'd wait for some spark, something to bring us back to each other. But it never came. And little by little, the distance settled in like a third presence in our home, always there, always felt, even if neither of us acknowledged it. Looking back, I can see how much we both contributed to that strain. It wasn't just the long hours or the business trips. It was the way we stopped showing up for each other emotionally, the way we let silence fill the space where conversation used to be. And the more I found myself retreating into the stable, the more I realized how much easier it felt to be there than to sit in the house, surrounded by all the things we weren't saying. I wish I could tell you that I found some quick fix, some way to bridge the gap overnight. But relationships don't work like that, especially when the distance has been building for so long. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going on like we had been. Something had to give. And whether it was finally finding the courage to speak up or recognizing how much I'd been holding back, I knew deep down that we couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to fully face what I had been avoiding for so long. For weeks, maybe even months, I had gone through the motions of my life, keeping myself busy, slipping out to the stable every day, falling into a routine that felt comfortable but also numb. I convinced myself that spending more and more time away from the house, away from Daniel, wasn't hurting anyone. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just passing time while he was gone, finding peace in the quiet moments with Orion. But deep down, I think I always knew it wasn't just about filling the hours. It was about filling a space inside me that had grown too big to ignore. Every time I walked back up to the house after being in the stable, that ache in my chest felt a little heavier. I'd step through the door, greeted by the silence that had become all too familiar, and I'd feel the weight of all the things I wasn't saying pressing down on me. I kept thinking if I just waited long enough, maybe things would go back to how they used to be. Maybe Daniel and I would fall back into sync, the distance between us shrinking without me having to confront it head on. But life doesn't work like that. You can't expect things to fix themselves while you stand still. And one day, after yet another quiet dinner, after yet another evening spent sitting beside someone who felt more like a stranger than a partner, I realized I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep hiding in the stable, hoping the disconnect in my marriage would magically disappear. I had to face what I'd been avoiding. I had to face myself. That night, I sat alone in the living room long after Daniel had gone to bed, staring out the window at the dark outline of the barn. I thought about how easy it had been to lose myself out there, how comforting it felt to be near Orion, to be in a place where I didn't have to think too hard or feel too much. But I also realized how much I had been using that comfort to avoid the harder truths. I had let my relationship with Daniel drift, not because I stopped caring, but because it felt safer to focus on something else rather than deal with the growing distance between us. I had been making choices, whether I admitted it to myself or not, that kept me at arm's length from the person I had promised to share my life with. And the more I leaned into the escape the stable offered, the more I had been shutting Daniel out. That realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't about blame or pointing fingers. It was about finally acknowledging my role in the cracks that had formed between us. I couldn't keep waiting for him to fix things, or for the silence to magically lift. I had to decide what I wanted, and whether I was willing to do the work to find my way back. The next morning, when I walked into the stable, I felt different. Orion was there, as steady and calm as always. But instead of feeling the usual ease, I felt something else, a quiet clarity. I ran my hand along his coat, taking in the familiar rhythm of his breathing, and I realized that as much as I cherished the comfort he gave me, I couldn't keep using it as a shield. It was time to step out of that safe space and face the reality of what my choices had created. That evening, I sat down with Daniel. I didn't plan some big speech. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't keep carrying the silence between us any longer. So I told him the truth. Not everything at once, but enough. Enough to finally open up about how I'd been feeling, how lonely I'd been, how much I had retreated into the stable instead of turning to him. It wasn't easy. There were tears, long pauses, moments where I wanted to retreat back into old habits. But for the first time in a long time, we talked. Really talked. And in that vulnerable space, I saw that he had been feeling the strain too, unsure how to reach me, unsure how to fix something neither of us wanted to admit was broken. It wasn't a magical fix. Nothing about facing the reality of what I'd been avoiding was simple. But it felt like a first step, like finally shining a light on the parts of myself I had kept hidden. It reminded me that relationships require presence, honesty, and the willingness to face the uncomfortable truths, even when it's easier to avoid them. That night, when I went to bed, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The silence wasn't gone, but it felt different, less like a wall and more like a space where something new could grow. And I knew then that the choices I made moving forward mattered more than ever.